So let me introduce today's speaker. This is the last in the seminar, Global Public Health Seminar series that we have in the spring. And it's especially a special pleasure to introduce today's speaker, who is Delilah Wilson. And she's going to talk about community street medics. Delilah is the founder of Diversified Integrated Resiliency Training Center, and she's a street medic organizer and trainer. And she's going to talk about this national collaborative of volunteers who provide medical support in situations that are frequently neglected by traditional providers, such as in protests and in disaster areas. In these situations, ad hoc street medic collectives set up clinics and field teams that provide health care to protect participants. They protect local communities and at-risk populations as well. They also train volunteers at all medical skill levels in the philosophy of community medicine's basic, initial, and secondary medical assessment skills, first aid for life-threatening injuries and illness, and the treatment of non-life-threatening injuries. Delilah is a graduate of the University of Montana, both in political science and with master's degrees here. And she has been the program coordinator for international development studies and the global public health program since their inceptions. So she brings a lot of experience and expertise to her talk today. So please join me in welcoming Delilah for her talk on street health.
So I got involved with street medics. My first contact with the concept of street medics, we'd been providing some little health care here and there at protests. For a number of years I was involved with Earth First and other environmental groups. But in 1999, there was what's become known as the battle in Seattle. The WTO came to the United States, and union organizers and environmentalists got together and planned a major protest. Now, in the United States, we hadn't had what would be considered a major protest in a long time. And so the battle in Seattle drew 50,000 people to protest the WTO meetings. And one of those people was a man named Doc Rosen. And Doc Rosen had been involved as a street medic way back when, and I'll talk a little bit about the history of them. And he was teaching just a little 3-hour class on how to deal with police weapons, particularly chemical weapons. And I was with a small group, affinity group. That's you know what they call a group of people who have an affinity for one another. And my affinity group actually was my family and a few friends. And so I had the most medical background. I had been a vet tech for a number of years, and I'd taken a lot of first aid classes. So I went to this training to see what it was about and learn some stuff. Had an asthmatic with us, and people who'd never been to a protest, and a child. So we decided that having a little medical knowledge would be a good thing. But protests in the United States at that point had remained fairly small and, well, not completely non-confrontational, relatively non-confrontational. And Seattle just blew up. There were injuries. There were 2 solid days of tear gassing, 24 hours a day, and police violence and clashes of protesters. And we treated hundreds and hundreds of people that were not only protesters, but street people who were caught up in the conflict, media people who were trying to record it. We treated just anybody who needed it. And those anti-globalization protests that were happening at the same time grew, and with them the street medic community grew. And after that protest in the Battle of Seattle, I was like, you know what, this is what I've been looking for as an activist. It's a way to engage without being angry. It's a really positive way to engage in my belief systems and be supportive and building something that is positive and bringing something to the world that I really thought was important, which is I really believe that healthcare is a human right. And so providing healthcare in situations where regular systems won't or can't is a really important thing. One of the things about places like the battle in Seattle is it becomes a police zone, it becomes a conflict zone, and regular EMTs do not go into it, and they cannot go into it until the scene is deemed safe. So we were the only medical providers in that conflict because regular EMTs wouldn't come in. And that, I was hooked. I was hooked. And at that point in time, my daughter, who is the blonde girl in this picture, was 7. And this is her a number of years later. She grew up to be a medic as well. And her best friend in Pittsburgh in 2009, I believe. So who are street medics? Peter talked a little bit about it. Street medics are from all walks of life. We have herbalists and acupuncturists and nurses and doctors and people who are just really passionate about being social justice, who come and we offer a 20-hour street medic training. People come from rural backgrounds and urban backgrounds. You know, we do suffer from whiteness in the street medic movement. That is changing to a degree as we get more and more involved with the Black Lives Movement. But what we find is in many of those movements, they take the information we have and they do what they should be doing, which is fitting it and changing it into trainings that really work for their communities. And that we really believe that with medical information, communities should have what they need and be able to do a lot of their own care. So this, like I say, the street medics are really a huge, diverse group of people who are just passionate about what they do. Let's see, is there anything I missed? You know, Peter talked about it, and we're the people who go where nobody else will go. When the tear gas flies and there's conflict, we're the people who don't walk away, but we walk towards that conflict because we go up there to look for protest. In disaster situations, we go into communities that nobody else is really serving at all because they're the people who need us. We do it all as volunteers. Nobody makes any money. We have no paid staff. We have no paid organization. We ad hoc organize ourselves and do the fundraising we need to respond to the situations that we find in front of us. And unlike state-sponsored like EMTs, we're subject to arrest. At Trump's inauguration, there were a whole group of people were rounded up and arrested at Trump's inauguration, and they were all charged with felonies because a few people broke some windows, so they arrested 200 people and charged them all with felonies. And in that group were several street medics who were there. And the court argument was they were aiding and abetting riot by providing medical care. The case was eventually, actually they lost in front of a jury. The street medics won in front of a jury. They were dismissed. So a little history about street medics. Street medics actually came about in 1964 during the African-American Civil Rights Movement. They were organized as the Medical Presence the Medical Presence Project, and they eventually became the Medical Community for Human Rights. And what they discovered, and they tended to show up, they would show up at protests, white doctors in white coats, and go stand with the people who were being subject to police violence. What they discovered is that it was actually a way of self-defense. Police were less likely to be violent with doctors there, watching them, and people were inspired and encouraged by knowing that somebody was going to take care of them if they got hurt. They found that violent incidences in jail went down when doctors started coming to jails to check on patients and treat them. So they found that their presence was very, very effective. And when things got rough, which they did during the Civil Rights Movement, and the police started hurting people, the doctors were able to be there and provide care. So this evolved into the early street medic groups, and some of those doctors came to believe that it shouldn't be just doctors out there, that anybody could be trained in a set of skills that would allow them to respond in a positive way and provide medical care during protests, like the Civil Rights Movement. And so they began training non-professionals as what became known as street medics. And so they provided, so street medics, the street medic movement continued and grew through the Civil Rights Movement. Street medics were involved in AIM. There were street medics at Wounded Knee in 1974. They were involved with Vietnam Veterans Against the War, the Young Lords Party, the Black Panther Party, and a lot of those revolutionary movements during the 1960s and 70s. A lot of street medics, when those movements tried to set up clinics, worked with street medics to help get community clinics set up. During the 80s, they kind of faded away. And there was not a lot of protesting going on in the United States during the 80s. There was some anti-nuke stuff, and groups like Seeds of Peace, who provide food, provided a lot of that medical care. So they were pretty quiet, and they weren't really doing much. The Colorado Street Medics, with a man named Doc Rosen, who's the person who trained me, continued doing street medic stuff throughout that time. I had a small group of people, the fellow activists that he trained, and they did some stuff during Operation Desert Storm, and they did some other things, but it was pretty quiet until 1999, when the battle in Seattle took place, when the WTO came to the United States. And when Doc came to that, and I connected with him and really wanted to do that, we started organizing trainings. That was in November. There was a major protest in April in DC. There were like 4 other major protests that year. And so we started going to all the communities that were hosting the anti-globalization communities. We would organize trainings, and we would go there and we would teach a new group of people to be street medics. And out of those people, we would find a couple people who were really engaged in interest, and we'd encourage them to become trainers, and we would invite them to our next trainings and the trainings after that to learn about how to be trainers. And through that, so the Colorado Street Medics and Doc Rosen and I were doing trainings, and there was also a group on the West Coast, the Black Cross Collective, that was doing some trainings. And in the next 2 years, we trained literally thousands of new street medics. And so it got to the point where people didn't have to travel across the country to go provide support for protests, because there were already local collectives and local street medics there to be providing that. So they really got moving then. So the foundation of street medics is a 20-hour community training, and Peter talked a little bit about that in introduction. What we offer is basic first aid. We focus a lot on assessment. We want people to be able to recognize when something's wrong and it's beyond their scope of practice. It's something they don't know how to treat, and it's a life-threatening emergency. And then we want to train them how to get help. I mean, this is our first focus. Recognize when something's going really wrong, and then how do you get somebody who helps you? Because in 20 hours, you're not going to become a doctor. You're not going to know how to do it all. So we want to make sure that people know how to engage in a way that's really positive with other people. And then we include some first aid. There's a lot of things that medicine doesn't treat. If you have a cut on your hand, you're not going to call the ambulance and have them come and treat the cut on your hand. But if you're living in a squat with 30 other people and no running water, getting that cut on your hand is treated is really important, because if it's not taken care of, it'll become infected, and some really bad things can go down as you go down that road can happen. So we do a lot of treating these small owies. Actually, that's not a real owie and boo-boo on that girl. That was a medic training, and we do moulage when we do our medic trainings, and so that was just a great road rash that we had moulaged on, so there's a picture of it. But it does, and at our trainings we do the first aid and the assessment, and then we also talk a lot about street tactics, how to go in, how to relate to the police, how to talk with police when you're in tense situations. Because sometimes you're in a situation where, I talked about how the EMTs can't come into a civil unrest situation. So that means that if you have a patient in a civil unrest position, you have to get them out. And the only way to get them out to the EMTs is to negotiate their way out through the police, because that's what is the block between, that's the line between where advanced help is and where you are. So we do a lot of focusing on how to relate to the police and how to understand when a dangerous situation is raising up. One of the things that happens with medics in street situations is people look to us to decide how the police are going to interact. And when they look to us, we don't want medics being like, oh my God, the police are coming, let's glove up and put on our mask, oh no, because then people are like, oh, something's gonna happen. So we really teach people to watch the police and watch the situation. A whole situational assessment is really an important part of our training. And then something that you'd never find in a Red Cross training, we spend a lot of time talking about chemical weapons, because we see a lot of that in the street. It's not what we primarily treat, but we do see quite a bit of that. So the chemical weapon protocols that were developed in the 1960s we don't no longer use, but they were effective enough that the military adapted them. And now many medical facilities actually use. We did some studies and we did some tests and we found better treatments for pepper spray and tear gas along the way. And many medical communities have adopted them because they are so effective. So part of our we talk a lot about ethics in street medic trainings. And here again is someplace where there's a few differences between us and what you would find in a standard medical practice. Do no harm is one that covers all medical practice. I think that's the first tenet of all medicine. But we really focus on consent in a different way. We work with a lot of communities and at-risk and high-risk communities where consent is really important. With transgendered communities, communities of survivors. So we really focus on consent in a different way, a proactive consent, where you go into the doctor and you sign they explain your procedure and they sign a consent form, and then you go through the procedure. Our consent is okay, it looks like you got hit really hard in the rib, can I lift your shirt? So I'm not just asking if I can treat the person, I'm asking every step of the way about consent. And part of the reason we do this is that street medics really operate under an ethic of humanizing a dehumanized situation. So when you are young and you're zealous and you're out there and then the police beat you and your friends up, that can be really dehumanizing for people. And to have somebody take time to care about them and to treat them like they were human beings and really be engaged in what they want and what they're comfortable with and make sure they're comfortable with how they're being touched and how they're being handled really does a lot to humanize a patient that is often lost in our medical system where they're treating bunches of people and it becomes much more machine-like almost. So that's a little difference. And then there's some difference in ethics depending on the collective. Many communities really want, and particularly right now, there's a conflict in ethics about, the standard was when I was trained as a street medic in 2000, we treat anybody, no matter what. No matter what. Once you're on the ground, you're a patient. I don't care if you were a counter-protester or a police officer. When you hit the ground, you're a patient. Now that's been a challenge for us because even though we're willing to treat police, rarely will the police allow us to treat them. And we've had paramedics on the site where on site where a police officer died of a heart attack and they weren't allowed to treat because they were in their street medic clothes instead of their paramedic clothes. But the street medic was willing to go in there. But now one of the things that's happening, I'll talk a little bit more about this later, is that there's a lot of street medics going to the KKK and fascist rallies around the country that are happening and who feel very nervous about the idea, particular street medics who are transgender or people of color, of trying to treat somebody who is a member, who's a KKK member, because they're afraid of what their friends will do. So, and that's an ongoing conversation in the street medic community, is how do we handle that? How do we handle the ethic of people are people, once they're patients, once they're hurt, they're people, but it can put other people in a dangerous situation to try and treat them, and just the conflicted emotions around that. So that's one of the challenges around our around those ethics. But we do talk about ethics and how we approach it, and we do it heavily in our trainings. And then depending on the training, we talk about some other things. I do a lot of community trainings and I always throw a disaster element, how to organize it after a disaster, how to think about creating medical care after a disaster, how to think about the things you need to provide medical care, where are you going to get clean water, how are you going to dispose of the dirty water, those kind of things. So depending on, we tailor our trainings to communities because each community has a little different need about their knowledge and we try to focus on that. And then of course part of our trainings, we always at the end of them do role plays where we set up scenarios that those communities are likely to face and work through them so people have an opportunity to make their big mistakes in scenarios instead of on the street. So we'll talk about a little bit about the organizational structure of street medics. We started buddy teams. There is never a street medic. There's always 2 street medics. Because when you're when things are happening and things are going down, you always want somebody to watch your back. You always want somebody around to help, to be that extra set of hands. And it's just safer, and do no harm, and part of doing no harm is looking out for yourself. And then we organize up to collectives. We have a lot of different collectives, and each of the collectives organize themselves in some way or another. They're not answerable to each other. Like it's on an international level, we share information, and it's really an international level. We have street medics all over. There's street medic collectives all over Europe. There's street medic collectives that all over. Everywhere there was an Arab Spring, there was a street medic collective. We were translating our material to have it sent over there. There's street medic collectives operating in Syria. There's street medic collectives across the globe. And what we do is we share information and we share discussion. But each collective is allowed to organize itself in its own way. Most of them have a anarchist organization style without leaders. Without direct leaders, and people work together and make decisions based on consensus on what their collectives want to work on. And a lot of them are ad hoc collectives, which come and go based on the protest. None of these are ad hoc. So we've formed a collective for the RNC, for the Republican National Convention. And we had Republican National Convention medics that went to Detroit, and we made patches for them. And one of the reasons we make patches at different events is because then we have some control over who is representing themselves as a medic. Because anybody, for a long time we wore duct tape red crosses, but anybody can put on a duct tape red cross and call themselves a medic, and that's happened and it's been a problem. So one of the ways we do that is we make patches, and you have to have a training in order to receive a patch. And so that's how we limit, that's one of the ways that we try and do a little self-policing for our organizations. So we'll talk a little bit where street medics work at. We do our work wherever there is need. These protesters, this is Chicago. This is mountaintop removal in the southeast. There's a WTO protest. That's an little Earth First protest in Ohio. The person in the pole on the far side is my daughter again. She flickers through my pictures from time to time. Up a pole. That was the protest that I learned I was going to be her direct support, and I learned I wasn't very good at that because there was 15 people in the building who got pepper sprayed, and all the other medics were undertrained and did not know what to do and did not have the gear. And so sorry, I know I'm your direct support, but I'm out. So that's where I learned that I'm really actually a medic at heart, and that's always has to be my primary role in protest now because I can't walk away. So we go to all kinds of places. We go to woods events, we go to gatherings, rendezvous, Earth First gatherings, rainbow gatherings. You'll find street medics. All kinds of, any kind of major woods training, you'll find street medics. And we're sitting there and we're setting up and we're offering care, whether the police are there or not. So what street medics do? So there's this kind of idea and this vision amongst many young street medics and as well as other people that that what we do is treat police violence. And you'll see that I have a lot of pictures of police violence because they're easy to find and easy to get. But really, most of what we do is provide health and wellness care during the protest, and we provide medical care in our clinics around protests and in communities. So what I mean by health and wellness is we walk around and we tape up people's blisters, and we offer them water, and we remind them to stay dehydrated. People come up and say, because I have my medic vest on, and so everybody at the protest, of course, knows I'm a medic. And so they come up and they say, do you have any aspirin? And it's like, when's the last time you peed? And they look at me like I'm crazy. And what it is the first sign of dehydration, one of the early signs of dehydration, is a headache. And it has nothing to do with how much you drink. People always say, how much have you drank? But if you can drink and drink in really hot weather, and if you're not peeing, you're not hydrated. And so I will do things like I'll give you aspirin if you drink 16 ounces of water in front of me. So we do a lot of that kind of maintenance, healthcare, interventions of just good, kind of good public health at protest. And then we set up clinics, and we get people, a lot of people who come to protests don't have regular access to good medical care. So they can come into our clinics with their abscesses and their foot rashes and their little travelers that shouldn't be with them and those kind of things. And we offer free medical care for those kind of things to make their lives better and to keep them healthier. And so that's a lot of what we do. Because, you know, what we do when we go into a protest is we set up a clinic. We find a building, we sometimes set up tents, and we set up a little clinic so we have a place to work out of. And then people take their gear. This is like a little, I also have a fanny pack that I'll wear, little clinic in motion. So I have what I need, and then I can refer back to our street medic clinic. And if it's something beyond their kin, we work with the local EMT. In most communities, they're willing to work with us, and then refer any patient who's beyond our skill or beyond our, you know, because we often have doctors, but are beyond the scope of what we have in our clinic available to us. We send out to the advanced ones. So yeah, this is just more pictures. So eye flushes, I've literally done thousands of these. What you see, the white running down his face, is liquid antacid. So the basic premise of any kind of chemical weapons treatment is that if you can see and you can breathe, you can move. So when people get tear gassed or pepper sprayed, they can't see, they often can't breathe very well, and so they can't move, they can't adapt, they get injured, they get stepped on. So we clean them up so that they can see and breathe, and our biggest tool in that is liquid antacid and water. We do an eye flush with water to rinse the chemicals out, and then we put liquid antacid mixed 50-50 with water, unscented, and it neutralizes a lot of the chemical weapons. We can have people gargle with it and spit it out. We can have people suck it up their nose a little bit and blow it out, and it'll neutralize it so they can see and they can breathe and they can move. This picture here is a picture of a reporter who was reporting in Miami in 2003. And I remember when I started as a street medic, I'd heard that term rubber bullet. And I know what a bullet looks like, you know, it's a bullet like this big, right? And so a rubber bullet, of course, is like a bullet this big that's made out of rubber. And working as a street medic, I learned that rubber bullets can be 6-inch long pieces of wood dipped in plastic that are like this long and this big. They can be, as in this case, it was one of the plastic bullets that are like this big around and this long that shot out of basically a .40 Magnum shell. So they break bones, and this guy in particular got it embedded. It hit him here, and it got embedded between his orbital socket and his skin. He was very upset. He was calling in the story as we were trying to treat him. So we treat a lot of that kind of thing, and we treat a lot of just general things. Street medics, in addition to protest, we started responding to disasters. And it was something that kind of evolved because of our community connections, right? So we're going to protest, and we're working with people who provide food at protests. We're working with local community organizers at protests. So when Hurricane Katrina hit, this man, who was a local organizer in the lower ninth, community organizer in the lower Ninth Ward, happened to know somebody who was with Seeds of Peace. And Seeds of Peace goes to protests and provides food. A friend of mine, Grumbles, who works for Seeds of Peace, recently posted on Facebook a recipe for potato salad for 10,000 people. So that's what they do. And they said, you know, we're here and we're feeding people, but we need some medics. And so they called their street medic friends, and within 48 hours after Hurricane Katrina hit, there were street medics on the ground. And they organized and worked with the local mosque and got a clinic up in there. And then there was a building across the street that had been a grocery store where somebody had been murdered and had been closed down. And they started looking at it, and they made arrangements and got the grocery store, and they started the Common Ground Health Clinic. For 9 months, they were the only real health care in the lower Ninth Ward for all the people who stayed through Katrina. The Red Cross came in, and they set up a Red Cross station where they provided like Tang juice and donuts to a population that has the highest rate of diabetes in the country. That was the Red Cross's input. And the streets medics came in there and they brought in doctors and they brought in nurses and they brought in herbalists and they got supplies donated from all across the country, and they had people sneak supplies through Army lines when they weren't letting anybody go in there, and they set up a clinic. And that clinic actually became a funded community clinic that exists today and is the only free health clinic in the lower Ninth Ward to this day. When Haiti hit, a lot of the street medic community, we started talking about how we could go and help. One of the challenges of Haiti is that it is a country that has more NGOs and more NGO funding than any other country in the entire world. Billions of dollars of NGO money go into Haiti. But it also suffers from all the problems with NGO money. So NGOs tried desperately to respond to Haiti. They couldn't really get out of Port-au-Prince. There wasn't much they could do. And they didn't have local contacts, and they didn't have local people they knew. And then a street medic friend, again, this person is actually a family member of somebody who knew street medics, who called up the street medics and said, I have family, and some street medics they knew and said, I have family in Haiti. They're in a small town of like 40,000 people, outside 40 miles from Port-au-Prince, and they have nobody. No aid is getting to them, and they need help. And we help under this idea of mutual aid, is that we're all equals in this world and project, and if I'm here to help you, you're not the victim and I'm not the hero. We actually help each other. I learn, you learn, we share. And so we put together teams of street medics that had support in the United States, who went out in teams of 6 with everything they needed to survive. They had their own food, they had water filters, they had their medical gear, because they did not want to go there and be a burden on a community that was already overly burdened. And showed up, and they learned a lot, and they got to do things, and were instructed to do things well beyond their scope. And they were of assistance, and they stayed with families and lived with intents and did it on a really low budget and made connections that last to this day. Because they, and so that's how the street medics respond to Haiti. We also have the street medics go to pretty much every disaster that's happened in the United States since then. Every flood. We had street medics go down to Texas. We had street medics in, the floods in the East Coast, like the 2 years after Haiti. So we now pretty much there's street medics that do disaster response training now. So pretty much street medics have now taken disasters and they look for local connections so they can engage with communities on a different level than the NGOs are. Then came Occupy to the street medic movement. And Occupy brought a whole new dimension that we were not at that time prepared for. Public health. We went into protests or disaster situations. We were there for a set period of time, or in the case of a disaster situation, we were working on, people still had some structures and were living their own lives, and we were providing a set service. But Occupy, people left their homes or didn't have homes, and they came and camped in the thousands all across the country. And their problems weren't, I got beat up by the police. Their problems were, I have hypertension and I can't get my medication. Their problems were dysentery because they didn't have hand washing stations. There was the only bathroom in Occupy New York for most of the time was a McDonald's 2 blocks away. There were thousands of people living in the park with no access to any kind of running water. So street medics started having to really get on top of the public health. How do you set up hand washing stations? How do you get people to actually use the hand washing stations you set up? How do you teach people about, proper food exchanges, and how do you deal with people who have chronic illnesses and no access to their medications? So there was this whole public health piece that we had to start picking up and learning. And fortunately, within the street medic movement, there were a half a dozen people easily accessible who had masters in public health, who actually had the knowledge and started talking about it and started thinking about all these things in a public health way. And that became a new dimension of trainings, and what we did as street medics was public health. So that was a big impact of Occupy. And then today, the street medics are still doing things. There are still street medics at this moment as we speak, out there doing tar sand stuff and pipeline stuff, mountaintop removal. They're doing community and herbal approaches to disaster situations. With the rise in the fascist movement in this country, there are trainings happening all across the country, almost one a weekend at this point in time. We haven't seen this level of training probably since 2000, 2001, because communities are just crying for it. And they don't want street medics, they want people to come and train them so they can provide their own community medical care, which is awesome. And there were street medics at the Healers Council when, what's her name? I have to look at it. Da, da, da. Oh yeah, Sophia, the woman who in Standing Rock, something exploded and blew her arm mostly off. She does have some function in it now. The people who took care of her and got out of there were street medics. When they hosed people down on the bridge in 20-degree weather, the people who found warm spaces and took people back and warmed them up, and a couple people actually got transported, those are street medics doing that. And they were working with the Healer Council with the Natives Healer Council, which created some challenges. You know, street medics, there's a good number of anarchist women at street medics, and they went there in the summertime, and they were told that they had to keep their shoulders covered and wear skirts, and they were a little like, okay, we have to be culturally appropriate. This is a challenge for us. Some of the hierarchical structures that street medics aren't used to working in caused some interesting discussions, but you know, their commitment to caring and taking care of people and providing health care in situations that other people don't have the skills to really kept them engaged, and they did some amazing work there. In Ferguson, there were street medics. When the white supremacists in Charleston plowed into the crowd, killing women and injuring dozens of people, it was street medics who responded. They were the ones on the scene. They're the ones that did CPR. They're the ones that patched up people. You know, there were several dozen street medics there when that happened. When street medics were there in the rally in Sacramento where people were stabbed, because now all these communities have their own street medic collectives that go to them. And that's a large focus of what's happening in the street medic community right now. It's actually kind of dual pronged. There's a lot of people who are getting more and more into providing health care to the communities in which to the underserved communities in which they live. Because in the era of dwindling Obamacare and the further marginalization of poor people and communities of color, they're finding it more and more necessary to start small clinics, wellness centers in communities that allow people free access, and to organize local community providers who have interest in this kind of work into serving in those communities. So they're doing a lot of that work, and they're doing a lot of work at the protest, the anti-fascist protest, as opposed to the anti-FA group, who also have their own street medics who do their own thing. But so there's a lot of people, so that's the main focus of the street medic work today. You can get information on the Medi Wiki. I forgot to bring a notebook and piece of paper. I was going to pass it around. I'll actually put a piece of paper up here. I'll just pass this around. You guys have pens. If you're interested in a street medic training, if you write down your name and email, about once a year we host one at the Dirt Center. We haven't organized it yet. Our summer's kind of looking busy, and we're trying to figure out where we can fit it in and if we have community interest in it. But if you're interested in a street medic training, we can do that. Missoula, fortunately, doesn't. I always feel silly when I dress up like a street medic and go to a protest in Missoula, because nothing ever happens. And we never even go long enough for people to get really dehydrated or good blisters even. So, you know, but if you travel, if you're looking to go anywhere, this is a good thing to have. The things you learn in a basic street medic training will serve you anywhere you go in the world where there's not regular access to medical care. And street medics who really get into it, the next training we suggest for them is a wilderness first responder. ARI offers one on campus every summer. That's a really amazing course. I've been trained as a wilderness first responder, and I've been trained as an EMT, and I was trained as a vet tech, and I was a vet tech for years. And really, I use my vet tech skills the most, and my EMT skills the second most. I mean, my woofer skills the second most. And there was nothing I learned in EMT that I didn't learn in one of those other places that has served me, because they're all based on the idea that you have a box with a lot of equipment. And street medics, all of our street medic trainings are based on wilderness protocol. And wilderness protocol is the idea of any time you're more than an hour from advanced medical care. And what we have learned is you can be in the middle of downtown Seattle and be hours from advanced medical care if there's a riot going on. There is no place you can go where with police intervention and conflict with crowds that you can't end up being hours from advanced medical care. So all of our training is based on that reality that we go in. So if you're planning on going to other countries, this is all good information to have for that. I'm sure there's things I forgot. I say different things each year, I'm sure, because I know so much about it. I could tell stories for hours. But do we have any questions?
Yeah, we have a few minutes for questions.
Yes, I was wondering, are there any special liability or professional practice implications for professional EMS workers that are off-duty but volunteering with you guys?
So because they're off duty and we receive absolutely no compensation for our work, they operate under the Good Samaritan law. So as long as they stay within their scope of practice, they are okay. Now we've had, state laws differ a little bit. So in Ohio, we had a physician who wanted to go on the street as a street medic. And his concern was if he had a critical patient and he handed it off to an EMT, was he then going to be liable? Because the rule is in healthcare is that you can't hand off a patient to somebody who doesn't have equal or higher training. And if he's a doctor, there's nobody who's going to show up in an ambulance that has equal or higher training. And what we discovered is that as long as he's operating as a civilian and not as a doctor, he can do that transfer in the state of Ohio. But in general, their licenses are protected as long as they stay within their scope of practice by the Good Samaritan law.
Tell me some more about, this is interesting to me, about the expansion overseas. You mentioned Syria. Do you have how many places do you have this now?
Well, because we don't have a central organizing thing, it's hard to tell. And the way we tell is we have people who say, we're street medics, we've got the outline for your 20-hour training, can you send us a translated copy of this? And that's how we find out that street medic collectives have popped up in different places. So during Arab Spring, we had people from Egypt, people from Syria, all across that area contacting us, asking us for materials. And we have a few people, European street medic trainers, who trained in that area. So it's just, it's just it's a network. It's very much a web without any clear line. I think they said in 2000, the wiki says in 2006 we had it in 10 countries because it had really moved into Europe at that point in time. So we had Australia and several European countries and the United States and Canada. But with Arab Spring, we really saw another expansion globally of street medics. And I don't know any of the Melbourne street medics, but they do work, I do know they do other work globally. Other questions?
All right, please join me in thanking the Hleath.